Can everybody hear me in the back? Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's workshop titled National Wildlife Refuges in the Ocean, Challenges and Opportunity. The goal of our workshop today is to initiate an ongoing discussion within the refuge system about how we can work together to embrace our significant role in conserving the world's ocean and coastal areas. The refuge system's stewardship responsibilities include some of the most important ocean and coastal ecosystems in the world. In January 2009, these responsibilities were significantly expanded following the creation of 3 enormous marine national monuments in the Pacific Ocean. In fact, when I first met Greg Sakanik, it was his first week on the job as chief of the refuge system. I got to congratulate him for increasing the size of the refuge system by 50% on his first week on the job. Now, some people may play down the significance of these monuments, but consider, we've been to the moon more times than we've been to the bottom of the Marianas Trench. And every time that we go to Rose Atoll, we discover new species. Meeting the stewardship responsibilities of these marine areas in order to do this, we're going to need to build new capacity to meet our science, management, and monitoring needs. This will include bringing new experienced staff, acquiring seagoing capabilities like we did in the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, and maybe even getting a submarine. I think Sylvia Earle might be able to help us out with that one. But we won't do this alone. We'll build new partnerships with NOAA, other agencies, scientific institutions, and others who share our interest in exploring and caring for these areas. The responsible stewardship of our marine and coastal refuges will be one of the greatest challenges in the decades ahead. The vision process gives us the perfect opportunity to raise these important issues within our agency. As the Refuge System's Marine Program Coordinator, my responsibilities include conducting outreach, both inside and outside the service, to teach people about the Refuge System's significant role in conserving marine habitat. I also represent the service on many marine-related policy groups, ranging from marine debris to ocean acidification. And I help to build partnerships with other agencies to help us fulfill our mission. First and foremost, I work for you, the people that work on the ground on these ocean and coastal wildlife refuges. Consider me your eyes, your ears, and your voice in the Washington office on all ocean and coastal related issues. Most of you won't be surprised to learn that we have a significant number of refuges in the ocean and coastal areas. And the yellow dots here are the ones that we identify as coastal refuges. But I want to stop focusing on those. All the refuges contribute to ocean conservation. Everything is uphill from the ocean. And, well, consider that every region has ocean or coastal refuges except for Region 6. But as Sylvia Earle told us today, during the Mesozoic era, about 90 million years ago, there was a great inland sea right on top of Region 6. So they shouldn't feel left out. Or you should simply consider that 2/3 of the Mississippi River watershed drains through Region 6, and all of that ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. This is truly a national issue. It's not a regional issue, and it's something that we could all work on together. And we have a lot to gain by increasing recognition of our marine role, both within the service and with our partners. But first, we have to go from looking at the refuge system like this and start looking at it like this. This is the true geographic extent of the National Wildlife Refuge System. And if you look, it's mostly ocean. From above the Arctic Circle to below the equator, across the entire Pacific Ocean, from the surface to the depth. The greatest depth in the ocean is a National Wildlife Refuge. This afternoon, our first 3 panelists will introduce us to some of the unique challenges of managing these vast and remote areas. Our last panelist will talk to us about a valuable interagency partnership that is helping us to address these challenges. We'll take a couple questions after each panelist, but we're really interested in hearing from you all today, too. So we're going to devote some time at the end to be an open forum where people can come up, either ask more questions or introduce us to a unique marine or coastal issue from your refuge or program. And because our time is limited, I'd like to take the opportunity to hear from everybody. And if you could, please fill out these survey cards that I have around on the tables. And what I'll do is at the end of the workshop, I'll compile all these together and share them with the people in the group that attended. And this is really going to help me have points of contact in the field on specific issues. You can also indicate down at the bottom whether or not you want to belong to an email list that I'll create, and I'll send out updates continuously 3 or 4 times a week about the Marine program. Actually, maybe every couple months. I won't spam you guys. So with that, I'll introduce our first speaker. Susan White is the project leader of the Pacific Reefs National Wildlife Refuge Complex, covering nearly 125 million acres within 3 national monuments and 10 national wildlife refuges. You know, that's bigger than California. Previously, she was the service's first superintendent for the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. And after this workshop, we'll actually have another workshop to teach everybody how to pronounce that correctly. It's also a pretty big place. It's 89 million. Outside of Hawaii, Susan has worked as a marine biologist in the Florida Keys Refuge Complex, was deputy manager of Ding Darling, and also served in the Southeast Regional Office. From 2000 to 2002, Susan was the first Refuge System Marine Program Coordinator in the Washington office, and we still feel your presence from those years. But Susan's 22-year career in marine protected areas began as the first manager of the Saba Marine Park in the Dutch West Indies. This fledgling marine park was and continues to be one of the models for marine protection in the world. Susan has degrees in marine biology and earth science and a certificate in secondary science education from Central Michigan University, and has been a member of IUCN's World Commission of Protected Areas since 1990. Susan, will you please start us out?
The greatest thing is looking around this room and seeing colleagues that I've worked with for, I've only been in the refuge system for 14 years, but have worked with some really wonderful people. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's hard to believe how a career goes through, and you move around and you get to do all kinds of wonderful things. I've been fortunate and privileged to have the responsibility for some of the most wonderful places I believe that exists in the world, and continue to. So Bret mentioned quite a bit, or introduced a little bit about the marine national monuments in the Pacific, and they do represent a very unprecedented conservation opportunity, not only for the National Wildlife Refuge System, but for the United States and the world in general, in terms of conserving large areas of marine ecosystems. So thank you all for coming today. I'm glad to see so many people, and I hope to give you just a brief glimpse of some of what our responsibilities are, the magnificent marine ecosystems in the Pacific that we are privileged to protect as a part of the refuge system. And I apologize ahead of time if I go over, but 125 million acres and 10 refuges, I just couldn't get it into just a few slides, so there's a lot of pictures. Yeah? Oh, there we go. So I always like to start with the end in mind. The take-home messages that you should leave here with are that we do have a significant responsibility in the ocean. I was very grateful to hear Dr. Earle this morning highlighting the importance of marine conservation and the role that the refuge system plays in that. It is an affirmative responsibility. Not only did the President create these monuments, he gave primary responsibility for the monuments for the three monuments that I'm currently managing. He gave responsibility for them to the Secretary of the Interior, and the Secretary then delegated that responsibility for the monuments to the Fish and Wildlife Service through the refuge system. And in doing so, he also created 3 new national wildlife refuges, the Marianas Trench being one, the Marianas Arc of Fire, which I'll get to a little bit, and also Wake Atoll National Wildlife Refuge, which was the last U.S. Holding out in the Pacific that wasn't part of the refuge system. So very, very exciting there. And in addition to that, these monuments and our marine refuges fulfill a very, very important role within the refuge system. If you remember the Refuge System Administration Act, it tells us our responsibility is to conserve the ecosystems of the United States. And when the Trench became a National Wildlife Refuge, I thought, well, there we go. That's the last ecosystem type of the United States that we don't have within the refuge system. So now we've got it. Now we've fulfilled that component of it, and to continue to maintain it and conserve it is fulfilling our mission. So two very, very important things. If you leave here with nothing, I ask that you remember those. So most of you are familiar enough to know that Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Bear with me if you know about all of this already. But a few people, I think very few people, realize how far-flung the refuges in the Pacific actually are. This is one of our favorite kind of depictions. Not only are we very continental-centric within the Fish and Wildlife Service and within the refuge system, but if you were to transpose the continental United States on top of the Pacific Ocean, it would fit in the middle of all of the areas that we manage out there in the Pacific, and then even further beyond that. We cover 5 time zones. For my people to get to work on the closest refuge takes 5 days by ship. And so there are real significant logistical challenges to be able to manage these areas, but make no mistake about it, they are unbelievably magnificent and vital parts of the ecosystem. So this gives a little better depiction of the monuments. Very briefly, we have 4 monuments in the Pacific. Papahanaumokuakea is the big worm up in the north there. It's on top of the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. A lot of people don't even realize that there's a chain of islands that extend beyond the main Hawaiian Islands. Papahanaumokuakea is now the marine protected area that manages them. We manage that through the refuge system and the Fish and Wildlife Service in collaboration with our partners at NOAA, the state of Hawaii, and also with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. That monument was created in 2006. It was the first one that President Bush created. And it really set the tone of, wow, we can do this. We can make vast places in the Pacific Ocean or in the ocean and set them aside for marine conservation. So then following, in 2009, President Bush created 3 additional monuments, and they're a little hard to see here. The pink circles around all of those areas are the exclusive economic zone that the United States exercises over the marine resources around those territories. The yellow boxes are part of the monuments themselves. Those are the monuments themselves. So the 3 monuments include the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument, excuse me, and that's most of those little boxes out there, the yellow boxes. It includes 7 core areas that are National Wildlife Refuges. Most people have heard of Palmyra Atoll National Wildlife Refuge. We also have Kingman Reef. Johnston Atoll just celebrated its 85th anniversary last month. We also have Palmyra, Kingman, Howland, Baker, and Jarvis. Are 3 units or 3 refuges that were expanded after the creation of the monuments. And then I did mention Wake is a new refuge that came as a part of the monument when the Secretary delegated it to us. Way down in the south, in the southern hemisphere, is the Rose Atoll Marine National Monument, which that boundary extends out 50 miles. The monument boundary is out 50 miles. The core of that within the atoll itself is the Rose Atoll National Wildlife Refuge. The Fish and Wildlife Service has primary responsibility for the monument areas and the refuge areas. With the exception of the fisheries resources, which the President rightfully identified that those are the primary responsibility of the National Marine Fisheries Service. Rose is also a little different because there's a potential national marine sanctuary there for the expansion of the Fungatelli Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And then way out in the west, the big block is the Marianas Trench Marine National Monument. And the Trench Monument includes 2 National Wildlife Refuges now. There's the Marianas Trench National Wildlife Refuge, which are all of the submerged lands of the Marianas Trench. There's also the Mariana Arc of Fire, which I'll get to a little bit later, but it's a ring of 22 undersea volcanoes that are phenomenally unique ecosystems. And then there's an island, the Islands Unit, which is that little triangular little blurb up there on the end. That's not a National Wildlife Refuge, but it is part of the monument, and it's part of Fish and Wildlife Service responsibility in conjunction with the National Marine Fisheries Service for the co-management of that. So again, just to remind you, within each of those blocks, it's a 50 nautical miles out for the monument unit, and then there's a core in the center of each, which is 12 miles from the lands. Most of those places, the lands are also refuge, and then 12 miles out, the seas are National Wildlife Refuge. So as I said, 2006 created Papahānaumokuākea. 2009, we got 3 additional refuges. Of that, 53 million acres are managed as a part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. All told, 125 million acres in the Pacific Reefs Refuge Complex, roughly 195 million square miles. I'm sorry, 195,000 square miles, about the size of New Mexico or Spain. And a really critical component of this, these scattered islands of, the scattered collection of islands and reefs and waters throughout the Pacific are essential habitat, not defined essential fish habitat, but they're essential habitat for the wildlife, especially the seabirds that are traversing the Pacific. The refuges and monuments form a network of lands and waters, and colleague Rich Albers talking last night brilliantly, he said, I get it, it's like duck refuges but upside down. So all of the activities going on underwater, but you've got migratory pathways, and you're having essential places where the wildlife is coming to feed and to breed. And I said, yeah, it's exactly like that. So thank you, Rich, for that analogy. But this network fulfills both the Fish and Wildlife Service and refuge system missions. The seabirds that are nesting on our islands are dependent upon the healthy fisheries and the diverse ecosystems to survive and to raise their families. I'm going to zoom in. This satellite track, I go back. The little inset there is a Laysan albatross. This is a Laysan albatross, and that's just one satellite track of an albatross. That albatross is leaving from Midway and kind of going all the way up around the Pacific to feed, and then they come back to their young on Midway. So if we zoom in, here we are on Midway. Those are the Laysan albatross. Oh, come on. Really, it's supposed to be clear. Midway is a phenomenal place, and in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, in Papahānaumokuākea, we have 98% of the breeding population of Laysan albatross. So these albatross, as that satellite track showed, are going off and they're foraging throughout the Pacific, and then they come together in the fall from all around the Pacific to meet up with their mate to lay one egg and to continue on the species. There's nothing quite like it that I've ever seen than the albatross at Midway. Albatross are pretty big birds. But in all of our monuments, approximately 28 million seabirds of 23 species are using the tropical Pacific as their nesting sites. These are just a few of the players. The lands and the waters really are interdependent on each other, and they're one ecosystem. And so people say, well, why are you protecting the oceans, and what's so important about the deep waters? Dr. Earl certainly helped to explain that this morning, but it's for people that are accustomed to the Fish and Wildlife Service, it's an easy drawback to the birds. The birds have to, they're seabirds, they rely upon the sea. The sooty terns spend 95% of their life out at sea. And the importance of these pelagic fisheries to that entire ecosystem is also vital. These are the tuna that you find in your cans of tuna fish. They're circling down below, and they'll form big balls of bait. They push that bait to the surface, and it's only by those large pelagic fish pushing those smaller fish up to the surface that the seabirds are allowed to forage. And so removing all of those top predators, removing those tuna in the system is reducing the prey source for the seabirds. A really critical link there that we need to keep intact. But it's not just the pelagic and open water, and it's not just about the birds. Near shore we have coral reefs, unbelievable coral reefs, the rainforests of the sea, immense centers of biological diversity of the ocean. These highly isolated reefs have not been impacted the way that more continental reefs are, and they enjoy really high survival rates of healthy, intact coral reef systems. They've been described by many scientists as some of the most pristine coral reefs left on the planet. Palmyra and Kingman alone support very, very high numbers of diversity. And at the top of the food chain, we have a lot of sharks in the monuments, like these Galapagos sharks. A commonality among all of the 4 monuments is that these ecosystems are dominated by predators, and it's really thrown the law of thermodynamics on its head. You know, we all learned that the pyramid is that we've got primary producers down below, and there's just a few of the top predators at the top. In the ocean, it's the opposite. In a healthy ocean ecosystem, there should be more top predators, but we've removed so much biomass from the sea that it's only in these remote, pristine areas that we still see that type of system that exists. In the monuments, the biomass of these top predators is higher than places like the Great Barrier Reef or other highly protected marine protected areas. The one thing that these diverse habitats also share in common is that they stand alone as being relatively pristine in an area, in a world that is constantly changing. And because they're relatively pristine, I say relatively because most of them had military occupation at some time or another, so they're not entirely pristine. But as the climate changes around the world, the globe, and we have global impacts, these areas that aren't impacted by overfishing or other continental forces are able to offer us a natural laboratory where we can understand what the impacts really are of a changing global climate, because all of the other anthropogenic effects are removed. They don't exist within these systems. And so we'll be able to, and we are currently studying them, to understand the effects of strong marine protected areas, the effects of global climate change, and how resilient an ecosystem could actually be given when all of the bits are there. So a quick tour, I'm going, I know, longer than I should. A quick tour of our 10 refuges and 3 monuments. The Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument, as I said, has 7 National Wildlife Refuges in it. At their core, they have the atoll or the island in the center extending out 12 miles. Palmyra alone is estimated to harbor 3 times the number of coral species than is found in the Hawaiian Islands, and 5 times the number of species of coral that are found in the Florida Keys. Sorry, Ian. I was privileged enough to spend the month of June on Palmyra, and the coral reefs there, you have those spiritual moments with your refuge, if you're lucky enough to be. And the reefs are like anything I've ever seen. There are places where there are mountains of reefs that are, of these branching corals that are as big as this room, and they're healthy, and they're intact. And all of the pieces of the system are there. There's big fish, little fish, there's sharks, there's turtles swimming around, and there's thousands of seabirds flying overhead. It's the thing that honestly, I didn't know what take your breath away means until I jumped in the water there at Palmyra, where my breath was taken away. If you haven't had that experience on your refuge or someplace else, I'm proud to say that I know that that exists. You can actually lose your breath with the astounding beauty of some places. On land, the forests of Palmyra, it's a wet atoll, it's a rainforest. We have Pisonia trees there that have been lost throughout most of the Pacific, and in Palmyra, there's a relatively healthy stand, and also on Rose Atoll. There are 5 species of land crabs, including the largest land invertebrate, the coconut crab there, that are very healthy. Again, many of them lost throughout most of the Pacific, but in Palmyra and on most of our refuges, we have pretty healthy populations. On Palmyra, there's 300 crabs per hectare. There's crabs everywhere. Kingman Reef is barely a spit of land, but underwater, the most unbelievable diversity that you can imagine, some of the highest recorded biological diversity in the sea. Johnston Atoll was a weapons reclamation site, and in 2005, the Department of Defense left it, and I'm happy to say that the wildlife has taken it back. Even with the runway that exists there, it's not active anymore, and a lot of concrete, the birds are happily recolonizing Johnston. We have an invasive ant there, the yellow crazy ant. Excuse me. And so we've stationed a team of 4 people out there to try to eradicate the invasion of the yellow crazy ant. We drop them off, and 6 months later we pick them up. We leave them with ant bait and keep in touch. Howland, Baker, and Jarvis, of course, our land-based responsibilities also include the protection of historic resources, such as the day beacons on Howland and Baker, the extensive remnants of the Battle of Midway, and the remnants of houses, agricultural terraces, and highly religious sites on Nihoa and Mokumanamana in Papahanaumokuakea. Because of the strong ties between native people of Oceania and the natural world, protecting these places also perpetuates the native culture that exists there. Perhaps the resource of which the monuments, of course, are most famous are the coral reefs. Here at Jarvis Island, the highest coral diversity that scientists have found. We have higher biomass on Howland, Baker, and Jarvis underwater, twice of the biomass of Papahanaumokuakea, 16 times the biomass that you find in the main Hawaiian Islands. And Wake is our new refuge within the Pacific Remote Islands. It's probably the oldest atoll in the world. It's still an active military base, so this refuge exists only in the water. There's no uplands associated with it. Wake's 3 coral islands and submerged lands are thriving, support 323 species of fish, hundreds of species of coral, as well as some of the larger wrasses, the Napoleon wrasse, the bumphead parrotfish, which are lost throughout most of the Pacific. Rose Atoll is the Marine National Monument down in the southern hemisphere. It's in American Samoa. It's rose color because of the crustose coral and algae that dominates the reef crest. And one of the smallest atolls in the world. As Bret said, every time we go there, and we don't get there very often, but when we do, we're finding new species like this cardinal fish. And in Palmyra, we're finding, this was the shocker, you'd think that we'd know about large mammals that exist in the ocean, but we don't. A few years ago, they rediscovered this whale. It was originally identified like 30 years ago in Sri Lanka from a skull that washed ashore, and it was identified as an individual species, and then it was never seen again, and so everybody said, no, well, that was a misidentification. It must have been this other species. Nope, we found it again in Palmyra, and now it's confirmed that this is an individual species, a whale. It's just one of the 20 cetacean species found within the monuments. Down in Palmyra and Kingman, or Palmyra last year, we even had orcas coming from you know, from the north. Again, the National Marine Fisheries Service has the primary responsibility for managing the cetaceans, but these are national wildlife refuges, and on refuges, everything is protected, all of the species. And so we're protecting the habitat as well as the individuals. And then, of course, there's the Marianas Trench. This is the coolest place that exists. The Marianas Trench, as I said, includes 2 refuges. There's the trench unit, the trench refuge, and the Arc of Fire. The Arc of Fire is an arc of 22 undersea mud volcanoes. These volcanoes, these are hydrothermal vents where back in the 80s, we first discovered that other life existed that wasn't photosynthetic. This is where we, you know, human beings identified that there could be organisms that live off of chemicals. So there's chemosynthesis going on. Where life is living at the bottom of the sea. They are the largest active mud volcanoes on Earth, producing almost pure carbon dioxide spewing out of their bottoms, and liquid sulfur. There's a liquid sulfur lake where there's fish that swim in these liquid sulfur lakes. They offer a really rare chance for us as scientists to understand what's happening in a changing ocean. Because of the sulfur and the carbon dioxide that's coming out of the mud volcanoes, we have highly acidic environments where life is thriving in the sea. And you hear about ocean acidification. It's a very real threat to our oceans. But here, we're able to see that that life is thriving in acidic environments. And so it's giving scientists a unique opportunity to understand how life might be able to adapt in the oceans. There's a molten sulfur cauldron at one of these volcanoes. The only other place that you find it is on Io, a moon of Jupiter. These astounding, this is a champagne vent in the Ifuku volcano. It produces almost pure liquid carbon dioxide coming out of the surface of the Earth, only known to exist in 2 sites of the world. There's the first flatfish ever identified to be endemic to these hydrothermal vents that are living solely off of the chemosynthetic polychaetes that are eating off of the sulfur-rich sediments. And then at the northern end of the chain, in the islands unit, there's this little inset is Mogg Crater. So this is part of the Arc of Fire refuge, and it's also part of the islands unit. So Mogg is it's about a mile wide in the middle of that crater, and it goes down hundreds of meters. So you have chemosynthetic organisms at the base, and then there's a dome that comes up in the middle. So there's chemosynthetic organisms living side by side with photosynthetic organisms, one of the most biologically rich hotspots in the world because of this, the duality of life that's living together. Just blows my mind when I think about it. And the Marianas Trench, once thought to be just, you know, a big, deep cavern down there, there's life all throughout the Marianas Trench. The trench is different because as a National Wildlife Refuge, we don't manage the waters of the trench. The trench refuge is only the submerged lands and the life that is living on those submerged lands. And so the scientists are finding all of these different invertebrates and fish that are living within the huge recesses, the abysses of the trench. And we're just beginning to learn. There's so much that we don't know because we can't get there. You talk about logistical challenges. We need a ship to get to our remote island refuges, but there doesn't exist a vessel to get us to the bottom of the trench to even see that refuge. So the submarine is a great idea. We just need to invent it at this point. So when the monuments were created, phenomenal ecological responsibilities and really vitally important to ecosystem protection, but they expanded our responsibilities. This unprecedented conservation initiative brings also with it unprecedented challenges to the Fish and Wildlife Service. Our laundry list of new responsibilities, everybody's got enormous responsibilities, so I won't get into them. But the planning requirement alone is monumental because, as I said, in some respects, we don't even know what exists there. So needless to say, we're extraordinarily pleased and excited for the challenge of managing these monuments, but it's a huge responsibility. Just think of trying to effectively manage 10.7 million acres per person with a budget of about 13.5 cents per acre. That's what we're dealing with. And so it's very difficult to get to them, very expensive to get to them. When we do, it's the basic inventories of what exists there and whether we've got invasive species that we can try to manage. We're borrowing staff from other projects to try to fill in some of the gaps. But just to give you an idea of how far behind we are, initial calculations through the Refuge National Staffing Model justify a total of 68.5 FTEs. And our staff is now about 20 for all 4 of the monuments. One more minute. One of the most important things that we're doing, though, with Palmyra is we have partners with the Nature Conservancy as a nature preserve there, and the Nature Conservancy is also has organized the Palmyra Atoll Research Consortium, or PARC. And PARC is a blue ribbon panel of 8 scientific institutions. And they've operated there at Palmyra doing some phenomenal science and understanding of what's happening at that atoll and also at Kingman. They've contributed more than $11 million since 2004, and a number of students have successfully defended their PhD dissertations. More than 55 peer-reviewed publications have come out of their research just since 2004. So, but beyond the administrative challenges, and the logistical challenges, we have the same kind of ecosystem challenges. We have the effects of climate change. We have the problems, difficulties with law enforcement. Alien species are there. We just completed a project to eradicate rats from Palmyra. As I mentioned, we've got the ants on Johnston. Maintaining the infrastructure in a highly corrosive marine environment is very difficult. We get shipwrecks, unfortunately, and shipwrecks feed other invasive species. The picture in the middle there is taking as a takeoff of an invasive corallomorph that's taking over one of those pristine reef areas of Palmyra. Marine debris is an enormous challenge and one that we're just starting to grapple with. But I believe our biggest challenge is ignorance. People don't know about the monuments, they don't know about our refuges, and because they're so far away, it's very difficult to impart the story and really the spectacular beauty that exists there and the importance of these monuments and these refuges for marine conservation. But as Rachel Carson said, all things return to the sea. And following in Dr. Earle's message this morning, I would also say that all things come from the sea. And so our challenge, and I think it's a challenge that I share with you, is rising to the challenge to make sure that everybody else understands about the mission of the system as a system and that all of these diverse components are there for the future. So thank you. I'm sorry I went so long.
Thank you, Susan. I think you covered about 10 million acres per minute, though. Yeah. We'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker. Originally from Miami, Ann Morkill returned to the tropics after 24 years in the northern latitudes, become the refuge manager for the Florida Keys National Wildlife Refuge Complex in 2006. Her focus is on establishing a science-based adaptive management program and fostering partnerships with the research and conservation communities to restore and conserve imperiled wildlife and their habitats in the face of many challenges, ranging from habitat fragmentation, development, invasive species, and climate change. Ann's previous experience includes refuge biologist for the Alamosa and Monte Vista National Wildlife Refuges, and after a short stint with BLM in Alaska, there's probably a story behind that, She returned to the service to be the assistant manager for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in 1998. From 2001 to 2006, she was deputy manager for the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. Ann has a BS in wildlife biology from Colorado State and an MS from zoology from the University of Wyoming. Please welcome Ann Morkill.
Thanks, Bret. Kind of oddly enough, I first got engaged with the idea of marine and coastal refuges when I was at Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and working on looking at coastal change and also policy issues with ambulatory boundaries and being able to assert our authority over some of the lagoonal habitats in the Arctic Ocean there along the coastal plain. Because fortunately the refuge there, formerly the range, was established before statehood. So, and I have a different issue here in the Florida Keys, but similar. So I just want to review some of the, give you an overview of the Florida Keys National Wildlife Refuges Complex and address some of the challenges that we have in managing. It's a postage stamp compared to the U.S. Postal Service perspective that you get from the Hawaiian Islands, and I'm followed by the Alaska Maritime Refuge. But so just a little bit of a perspective to zoom in. The Florida Keys National Wildlife Refuge Complex is at the southern tip of the peninsular Florida, and we have many influences from the Gulf of Mexico, from mainland Florida, and the Caribbean. Most of our plant species are West Indian, Caribbean origin. Many of our mammalian fauna come from the mainland, so we have endemic subspecies of many of mammals that are found on the mainland. And then our avifauna comes from all over, from continental U.S. as well as from the Caribbean species. Within the Florida, just want to point out down at the bottom, if I get the right angle here, we have 4 national wildlife refuges in the Florida Keys. Our newest one is up at the top of the Keys chain, just as you come off the mainland, off of US 1, and that's Crocodile Lake National Wildlife Refuge. And I'll be spending most of my time today talking about our 3 refuges in the lower Keys. So just to orient you, we've got Key West, the city of Key West here, and Big Pine Key. This is about a 30-mile stretch. So we have 3 wildlife refuges. We have a fairly old one, Key West National Wildlife Refuge, established by Teddy Roosevelt. The blue outline is Great White Heron National Wildlife Refuge. It's all backcountry islands. And then the National Key Deer Refuge, which has some overlap with Great White Heron, includes some of the what we call mainline islands that are connected by US 1. And then the bottom right is an inset of Crocodile Lake National Wildlife Refuge. As I mentioned, Key West Refuge, established in 1908 by Theodore Roosevelt. The administrative boundary covers over 208,000 acres, within which are 2,000 plus land acres, islands within that boundary. And this was established as a preserve and breeding ground for native birds, so the emphasis is on bird management. The Great White Heron Refuge, established in 1938, it as well has over 200,000 acres of lands and waters within its boundary. 6,300 approximately are island acres above mean high tide. And it was specifically for a breeding ground for the great white heron and other migratory birds and wildlife. And of course, both of these refuges were during the time, I forget who referenced the vanity of greed of the plume hats, is why Theodore Roosevelt and his later successors had the foresight to put aside these areas. National Key Deer Refuge, established in 1957, primarily to protect the key deer, but also there are a number of other endemic species that benefit. It's about 84,000 acres within that rectangular boundary, almost 9,000 land acres in fee title, as well as almost 1,000 acres of state-acquired and county-acquired lands that we manage under lease agreements. And then finally, the Crocodile Lake Refuge, 1980. It's all land acres, although a lot of that is mangrove, 6,600 acres for the American crocodile and other federally listed species. This is a list of only the federal, doesn't include all the state species of threatened and endangered wildlife within the Florida Keys National Wildlife Refuge. The majority of these you'll see are terrestrial species. We have insects amphibians all the way up to mammals and birds. And so this is where most of our work is. And so there's very little emphasis on some of the marine species, of which there are a couple of coral species that were recently, staghorn and elkhorn, that were listed that are managed by the sanctuary. Just a real quick, to let you know what I'm going to talk about as far as the Florida Keys ecosystem. If you're looking from left to right, the transition, the Florida Bay, the Gulf of Mexico side, the blue arrow points at what is mangroves, but the next slide is going to show you basically all the upland habitat types. It's actually quite a diverse ecosystem on the islands. And then we go down, we've got the inshore patch, mid-channel, offshore patch, and the fore reef. Some of the boundaries of our refuges cover all of these habitat types, but as I'll explain, we actually emphasize mostly the terrestrial and habitats, mainly because that's where our priorities are with threatened and endangered species. So if you think of that mangrove, it's actually a very diverse habitat, and I'll be going through a series of pictures, but you know, if you go kind of inland, if you consider this an island, we also go all the way up to a pine forest. So just a quick overview, we've got some coral reef and seagrass meadows. Again, you'll find out that we co-manage these areas with the state and also have a great relationship with the sanctuary that focuses on the coral reef and the seagrass areas, but they're really critical supporting some of our other species of interest like endangered sea turtles and wading birds. Of course, the mangrove forest islands, tidal creeks and tidal flats, very important for nesting water birds. Even some of our neotropical migrant birds, the white-crowned pigeon is a state-listed species, winters in the Caribbean and nests in the islands of the Key West and Great White Heron National Wildlife Refuge, and of course the American crocodile nests in areas of mangroves in the upper part of the Keys. A little bit higher elevation, relatively speaking, beach dunes, beach ridge hammock, coastal rock barrens, really important for our migratory shorebirds. We also have a candidate species, soon to be listed species of butterfly, the Miami blue butterfly, that was thought to be extinct, found in a state park in the Keys, and most recently had a volunteer go out with our colorblind biologist who had been going out there for 20 plus years, and lo and behold, there's the Miami blue butterfly out in the Key West Refuge. The population in the state park has now disappeared, and so we currently now have the only known populations of this critically imperiled butterfly species. And of course, we host nest sites for 4 of the 5 threatened and endangered species of sea turtles. A little bit further inland, lagoons and salt ponds are really important. We don't know too much about them, but we're starting to look at these areas, and especially the fish assemblages that are in here, and how they support some of our wading bird species. Even the key deer rely not so much on the water, but mangrove is one of their favored forage species. Salt marsh and woodland areas are really important for the Lower Keys marsh rabbit. The bottom picture there, I consider this one of our most imperiled and highest priority species. It's through loss of habitat and most currently prey to the feral cat. So we've got an interesting socio-political issue there to deal with. And it provides a lot of habitat for neotropical birds as well. Further up, the elevation tropical hardwood hammock. It's the Key Largo wood rat at the top. Key Largo wood rat and Key Largo cottonmouths are found only on the Crocodile Lake National Wildlife Refuge and adjacent state park area on Upper Key Largo. And the Shell swallowtail at the bottom is an endangered species, I believe the first insect to be listed under Endangered Species Act. And finally, our higher elevation, and relatively speaking, this is about maybe 9 to 12 feet above sea level. We've got the pine rockland forest. It's a fire-dependent habitat where we use prescribed fire to maintain this succession, and it's integrally linked with freshwater resources, freshwater marsh. We have solution holes like the one in the bottom right, and there's a freshwater lens underneath the islands that support this habitat type, and a number of endemic rare plants, butterflies, and of course the key deer are associated with this very small habitat, maybe about 3,000 acres left in the Keys, all on the Key Deer Refuge. We also have designated wilderness. In 1975, the Florida Keys Wilderness Area includes all the islands within the Key West National Wildlife Refuge and a few islands in the eastern portion of the Great White Heron National Wildlife Refuge. So we have wilderness values to consider as well. So as I alluded to, we actually don't, we've got 200,000 plus acres in each of the Key West and the Great White Heron National Wildlife Refuge, as well as the overlap area in Key Deer Refuge that are submerged lands and waters. Florida was established as a state in the 1800s, so it predates the refuges, and under the Submerged Lands Act, they have authority over the submerged lands and water. But it's difficult, you know, to deal with impacts and public use and draw that line at the mean high tide line. So it was in the 80s and late 80s, there's an increasing use and access by the public to these areas. So the state of Florida and the Fish and Wildlife Service entered into an agreement which allowed for refuge management of certain areas. There's been solicitor's opinion that says we can go very far with this particular authority, but right now it's restricted to certain islands, nesting islands for nesting birds, where we need to manage the access within the water to reach those areas. So this particular management plan had established different types of restrictions, anywhere from closed areas to idle speed or no motor zones. One thing that was really critical is that it closed the entire backcountry of Key West and most of Great White Heron National Wildlife Refuge to the use of personal watercraft or jet skis, which were proliferating in the 80s and are still a big tourist attraction. It also prohibits use of airboats and hovercraft and aircraft landing and water skiing in these areas. So that's really important, and it not only protects wildlife and reduces disturbance, but it just enhances that wildlife-dependent recreational activity that the public enjoys in the backcountry, whether it's flats fishing or snorkeling, swimming, kayaking, for example, without having jet skis whizzing around you. This is just a map of the backcountry. I don't know how easy it is to see, but these personal watercraft closure zones, this is most of the boundary of the Great White Heron National Wildlife Refuge. So there's intense use and breaches of the boundary in the area, especially around Key West, where we have a lot of our jet ski operators. And then Key West National Wildlife Refuge just isn't to scale. It's actually out here to the west of Key West, is also closed to some of these activities. So another thing that came into play during this time was the establishment of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. And the outermost boundary here is the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and within it you can see our National Wildlife Refuges as well as Dry Tortugas National Park, and then there are a number of state parks and former small sanctuaries, and it became this larger sanctuary. The sanctuary management plan recognizes the Florida Keys Refuges as existing management areas, and so our regulations come into play. And as well, they took those areas that under the Backcountry Management Plan or that Submerged Lands Act, where we had certain restrictions, and adopted them as zones called wildlife management areas. So they can use Sanctuary Act to protect these areas, but they can also use Refuge Authority and vice versa. So it was a great recognition. And one thing I've noticed recently too in recent years is the sanctuary, which most of its emphasis is on the Florida Reef Tract that everybody's more familiar with, which is out in this area. They're giving more attention both in their law enforcement activities and just some of their, and they're reporting their existing conditions and status reports, looking at these wildlife management areas as part of their ecosystem and their management responsibility, and reporting on birds and other things that are above the water surface, not just what's below. These are ways we're trying to reach out to the public. On the left is actually a fairly large panel that are installing at our boat ramps. There's a few people who worked in the Keys, and this is just an update of the old backcountry map to inform the public about the restrictions and the uniqueness of the area. And then talking about some of the shallow water resources and nesting birds in these areas to help people plan backcountry trips. And more recently, the personal watercraft industry has mostly always been very much against the prohibition of jet skis and tried to sue the state of Florida to say it was unconstitutional, but that was, it stood its test, which was great. Now they're coming around to actually working with the sanctuary and the refuges in creating an awareness among personal watercraft or jet ski riders about some of these areas and where they shouldn't go, and even in places that they do go, how to have a good wildlife ethic. And so that's the Blue Rider Awareness Program. So there's a lot of coordination and collaboration in terms of managing our marine portions of the refuges. And this is just the beginning of a list of some of the activities. There's a new visitor center, the Florida Keys Eco Discovery Center. It's actually about 3-4 years old now in Key West that is run by the sanctuary, but was built in partnership with the National Park Service, ourselves at Fish and Wildlife Service, South Florida Water Management District, and the state of Florida. And they cover all those ecosystems I talked about. They have some great displays about the pine rockland and the hardwood hammock down to the coral reefs. There's a Sanctuary Advisory Council that we serve on as non-voting members, as well as a water quality protection program that covers not only water quality, but coral reef and seagrass long-term monitoring, education and outreach, ecosystem restoration working groups. Team Ocean is a volunteer corps that goes out, and on the good, flat, calm days, they're out on the reef track educating divers and snorkelers. And on rougher days, they're actually out cleaning up marine debris on our refuge beaches. We're trying to establish a kind of a relationship with the sanctuary friends and our own friends and volunteers of refuges. And there's a pretty long-term, successful collaboration with environmental education in Monroe County, which is the Florida Keys too, with all the different agencies. And as I mentioned, we do a lot of coordination with law enforcement. I have 2 positions on my org chart, but I have only one that's filled for that entire complex. And the sanctuary isn't much better off, actually. I think between the sanctuary and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, there's maybe 14 officers for the entire Keys, but only 4 are ever working at any one time for a 100-mile plus stretch of 170 if you go all the way out to the Dry Tortugas. But we also work closely with the National Marine Fisheries Service and others. Marine debris and derelict vessel cleanup, mostly covered by the county and the state. And then we have a new Overseas Heritage Trail, Invasive Species Task Force, et cetera. I'm going to have to go fast. I'm only halfway there. So some of our management challenges, nothing new here. Increasing public use, which results in prohibited uses, disturbance to wildlife and habitats, loss of wilderness character, invasive exotics, hurricanes, and sea level rise. Just some examples. This little island, sand spit on the left, is what we call Wilma Key. It was created by Hurricane Wilma's storm surge. Most of the locals know it as Bruce Key, and they don't spell it like B-R-U-C-E, but brew, as in Wisconsin brew, ski. And we had a hard time keeping them off of this because there's actually very little sand, exposed sand in the Keys. And with some signage and cooperation with the sanctuary and the state, we've now documented over 26 species of birds using this when they're not, now that the public is respectful of this little new island. Trespass, prohibited use, there's a campsite behind the sign that says no camping, cutting of vegetation, fires. One of the issues we have not grappled with recently, there was some effort back in the 80s, early 90s, but that's looking at water-based activities that are in the water, but then they bring their clients to the refuge, their commercial activities, where are they relative to the mean height water line. The top right, if you can't tell, that is a inflatable glacier-like rock climbing wall that floats out there. So there's a lot of extreme sports stuff off of Key West that People go all the way to Key West to rock climb on a fake glacier. Cuban migrant landings have been an issue, although not necessarily recently, with the wet foot, dry foot policy. If they can make it to land, then they are granted entry into the United States. And so it's not so much the individuals themselves, but the boats and the gas and the oil and the garbage that's left behind after they've been on these islands until the Coast Guard comes and gets them. And of course, invasive exotics. Right now, we've documented, unfortunately, that the green iguana, which is proliferated throughout the Florida Keys, is now on our most remote backcountry islands. The left atoll, Marquesas Islands, is 12 miles out from Key West. And we've also that's a boa constrictor in the middle that was caught on No Name Key, for those of you who've been down there. Massive guy. And monitor lizard and tegus are now showing up in the upper Keys. Another great coordination with law enforcement. This was with National Marine Fisheries Service and the Office of Law Enforcement. Hard to see, but all of these yellow and pink dots, these are hundreds, if not thousands, of these fake habitats that are put out. It's literally garbage. Everything, including the kitchen sink, are put out there, and it attracts lobsters. And then they illegally harvest hundreds, if not thousands, of lobsters, keep them in underwater pens, and then when the season opens, they bring them in as if they just got them all legally. So submerged marine debris and hurricanes. Hurricanes, I mean, the Florida Keys is a disturbance regime, so it's evolved with disturbance, but the question is whether or not there'll be increasing frequency or intensity with climate change. And if we don't have enough time in between events for the habitat to recover, what will that mean? Just a couple more. Sea level rise, of course, this is just one example of some work we're doing with the Florida International University and the Nature Conservancy using high-resolution LiDAR imagery to look at sea level rise impacts. On the left is Big Pine Key. This is the heart of the Key Deer Refuge, about mile marker 30 of the US 1. If you've ever driven to Key West, this is current conditions. The brown are the higher elevations. Again, that's about 3 meters above sea level, so high, relatively speaking. Down to the green, which are the lower elevations, tend to be the salt marsh and mangrove habitats. On the right is the worst of the worst case scenario for the IPCC. I think that's 2, I can't quite see it from here. Oh. Yeah, 23 inches, 2 feet. Right now, there's people talking about 5 feet sea level rise by 2100. So you can see that even under this, what's now considered a conservative case, we've lost half of the upland habitat. And so, of course, what we get is we get plant communities that are shifting in response to these major, what we call ramp disturbances or sea level rise, and then these pulse disturbances that the Keys have evolved with, whether it's fire or storm surge or wind damage. And how the plant communities will, over time, succeed. Maybe with some intervention such as fire, we can keep pine rockland fire, but without fire, with a storm surge, it goes to these more salt-oriented habitats. And just one thing I added here is even, we might go to more of a mangrove ecosystem, but might even become more submerged land. And I joke with the sanctuary superintendent that I might be working for him one day. But this takes up a lot of our interest and attention right now, is looking at sea level rise. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ann. We'll go ahead and wait till the end to take questions, just so I want to make sure I leave enough time for our last 2 speakers. Steve Delehanty is manager at Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, home to 40 million seabirds. Steve has worked on refuges and wetland management districts for 25 years in 5 states and 3 regions. A native of Minnesota, Steve reported for duty at Alaska Maritime, shocked to find a whole lot of water containing salt, funny things called tides, web-footed birds which neither quack nor honk. Steve says there's not a bad job in the refuge system, but this one is the best. Please welcome Steve Delehanty.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be here, and yeah, of those many refuges and regions, none of them were coastal, so the Southern Pacific gets Susan White's experience, and Alaska was stuck with a duck guy from Minnesota. But I'm here to talk about Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. As I like to say, the most amazing place you've never seen. It is spectacular, and before I forget, I want to reiterate something that Susan brought up that is so important. I'm going to be talking really about the terrestrial, the refuge lands, but it is really just silly to talk about Alaska Maritime Refuge or really any of our marine refuges without talking about the marine systems, thinking about that. So I'll be talking about land, but please understand that the birds, the marine mammals, and everything else is utterly dependent on the marine system surrounding those terrestrial areas. And also, Susan, by the way, you can have your breath taken away. Just jump into any of the water around the Alaska Maritime lands, and it will take your breath away there as well. So, a really cool place. And here it is. It is the colored splotches of land. It is remarkably spread out. Far-flung National Wildlife Refuge from the islands in the Gulf of Alaska in the southeast Alaska Peninsula, stretching west through the Aleutian Chain and north through the Bering Sea all the way into the Arctic in the Chukchi Sea. So very spread out. It was created in its current form by the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act of 1980, but it was derived from various refuges that had been created beginning in 1909. So ANILCA, as that very significant lands law for Alaska is called, consolidated these refuges, expanded it, and created this thing called Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. And very importantly, it purposely didn't create a refuge that was geographically based. It created one that was marine-based. It took almost all of the major seabird colonies of Alaska and put them under the jurisdiction of one refuge. So I'm not used to being upstaged when I do this wow slide, but I have been. So instead of having 1.5 continents, I've only got one. But I'm going to really focus a bit on the logistical challenges of Alaska Maritime and our marine refuge management. And so Alaska Maritime stretches from roughly the equivalent of Georgia to North Dakota and west to California. Our headquarters in Homer, Alaska, is in the equivalent of southwest Missouri. So imagine trying to take gear, people, supplies, whatever, from, say, Joplin and get them to Bismarck, North Dakota, or San Diego, or Atlanta, but there aren't any roads, and there isn't any commercial air traffic to most areas, and it's too distant and too remote to use small aircraft like much of Alaska uses the bush plane work. So we have this ship, the Tekla. Tekla means eagle in the Anungan or Aleut language. It's 120 feet long, so she's not real big, but it's also not real small. It's very well designed, very well built. It's excellent for near shore work, which we do a great deal of, but it is also fully capable of crossing the open ocean. And the sailing season for Tekla typically is roughly mid-April until through September, and occasional periods of sailing in the winter, but the core season is in the summer months, and sails typically 16,000 nautical miles a year. The Alaska Maritime, through ANILCA, through the Lands Act, was given purposes, and I'm not going to go through them, but I will spare you that. But I want to point out two things. First of all, number one, which I think was really far-sighted, and this is true for all Alaskan refuges, that we have a mandate to conserve fish and wildlife populations and their habitats in their natural diversity. And it's really a hint, I think, of the Refuge Improvement Act to come. That was 1980. It was really far-sighted, so we have a mandate for natural diversity. And then number four, which is very unusual for a National Wildlife Refuge, we have a mandate to support national and international marine research, and we take that very seriously. So we use both the ship, the Tekla, as a platform, and also refuge lands, and do a great deal of collaboration on research with people from many universities and, in fact, many nations who are interested in marine research on and around Alaska Maritime Refuge. And we get to do all of this in some of the most beautiful and remote parts of the world. It is just absolutely spectacular country. Bret mentioned the 40 million seabirds that breed on Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, so it is just, it's really, truly globally important. Also, huge numbers of marine mammals which depend on the refuge for as rookeries and haul-outs, and for near shore, like sea otters, for example, in the kelp forests surrounding refuge lands. We also have some endemics or species which, if not exclusive, are nearly exclusive to Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, like the red-legged kittiwake and McKay's bunting, but those are vertebrate species. We know very little and are trying to learn about plants and invertebrates and things. We're collaborating with an entomologist from the University of Alaska and on arachnids in the Aleutian Islands, and pretty much every visit he comes up with species that are new to science. We have a very comprehensive and sophisticated biological effort on the refuge. It's something that everyone at the refuge is very proud of, and is, I think, rightfully highly regarded in the refuge system as a leading biological program. I don't have the luxury of time to kind of really go into the thought process of what we do and why we do it, but it involves some of these things. We have annual sites that we go to year after year and do seabird monitoring, as well as sites that are monitored only periodically, both for population to know how the birds are doing, but also using seabirds as sampling units going out across this marine environment and telling us something about the state of the ocean at their concentrated breeding grounds. We do a lot of research collaboration. We have many dozens going on every year. There are just a few of them that I threw up there. And then we do a great deal of work with invasive species. That is our primary restoration effort and restoration tool at Alaska Maritime is not just controlling, but actually eradicating invasive species from islands. This shows those sites on the refuge that are monitored where seabird monitoring occurs on an annual basis. It was designed so that the sites were, very crudely about 500 kilometers apart to take in the entire swath of the refuge. And I want to point out, because I'm going to show you a slide in a minute, this one right here, Kasatochi Island is no longer an annual seabird monitoring site, and I'll explain why in a minute. But part of our huge logistical challenge is getting people and gear and supplies and things out to each one of these sites every year. It's a major effort and a major expense. This is our field camp at Kasatochi Island, and it's a pretty typical little place where people are dropped off in early May and they're picked up in September or late August, typically in September. And we not only need to get them there, but when they're there, we need to take care of people and keep them safe, and that's a whole effort in and of itself. There are medical emergencies and things that happen, and in this case, Kasatochi, like much of the Aleutian Island chain, is of volcanic origin. It's an active volcano, and Kasatochi erupted catastrophically in 2008, and there's a long and fascinating story involved with the rescue of the biologists, our employees who are on that island. But to cut to the chase, the short answer is they escaped that island with 50 minutes before the eruption. So this is the campsite pre-eruption, And that is the campsite today. The little red arrow shows the cabin location where that crew was located. We do, as I mentioned, a great deal of work with invasive species, starting with fox, mostly Arctic fox. Sometimes it's been red fox. We've eradicated fox from over 40 islands, and ungulates, various ungulate species, cattle and reindeer from 4 islands. We've got more to go on that. And rather famously, rats from 1 island, Rat Island. A new book just published called Rat Island about not just this rat island, but invasive species eradication projects across the globe. That's very interesting. This guy was aboard the Tekla last year, the author, and speaks about a number of different refuge units in the book. So to come back to this logistical challenge theme again for a moment, this is Rat Island. Which is about 7,000 acres. It's roughly 1,000 miles west of Anchorage. So we had to get a bunch of stuff there to do this this rat eradication. We need ships and helicopters and bait and people and food and supplies and everything. And due to the vagaries of weather, we needed to be prepared to be there for up to 6 weeks or so. So we have to get people out there, and we have to take care of them while they're out there. And of course, the best way to deal with invasive species is to prevent them from occurring in the first place. And we have an absolutely wonderful visitor services outreach and education team at Alaska Maritime. They do all kinds of great work, education in remote rural communities associated with the refuge, run just a world-class visitor center. If you've ever been to Homer at the Islands and Ocean Visitor Center, you'll know what I mean. It's just absolutely spectacular. And do many other things like education, trying to prevent the spread of invasive species onto refuge lands and other lands. The refuge is also chock full of archaeological treasures, both pre-European contact human settlements and archaeological resources, and also World War II items. This is the island of Kiska. Kiska and Attu, both in the Aleutians, are sites of World War II battles, and were in fact occupied by the Japanese during World War II in what's often called the Forgotten War. But the first time that U.S. North American soil had been occupied by a foreign country since the War of 1812, and the site of extremely aggressive efforts by American forces to retake the islands. And I've had the honor of being both on Kiska and Attu, and Kiska, it's just spectacular. Like, I mean, here's this gun, it's just there, and there's still air in the rubber tires on the rubber tired vehicles, and there's sake bottle laying in the grass, and unexploded ordnance, which you try not to touch. It's just there, and it is, I'm not an archaeologist, but archaeologists tell me it is probably the most important World War II battlefield on Earth, because it has just been left alone, and this the remoteness and the harsh weather conditions have delayed weathering, so things are in remarkably good condition. Here's an example of a bomber that crashed on Atka Island. Thankfully, the crew survived. This is a U.S. plane in World War II, and there's the plane today. It's just still sitting there. And it's really remarkable. Those resources are significant that recently the national monument has been declared on some of these key World War II sites. So there are many, many layers of protection of parts of the refuge. It's National Wildlife Refuge. About 2 million acres of the 3.5 million acres are wilderness. We've got national monument. There are many, many layers of interest. So that is a very quick summary. I'm going to show you, I have just a few copies of a wonderful movie that does a better job than I could ever do of explaining Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. It's called Journey of the Tekla, and first 4 people to grab them who promise that at least 10 other people will get to see the movie can take them home with them. And if you want to win a beer bet tonight, the furthest west refuge in the refuge system is Alaska Maritime. No, because 180-degree meridian runs right through the western Aleutians. So, see, I could have won a beer bet from Susan. And the furthest east National Wildlife Refuge in the refuge system is Alaska Maritime, because just on the other side of the line, there's more refuge. So, there's some trivia. There's only about 100 of you, and there's 1,000 of them out there that don't know that secret. So, thank you.
So we're obviously going to go over a little bit. So I'm going to park myself back by the back door and make sure they don't kick us out. And Stacy says we have some time to go a little bit over it. So I want to give Lauren Wenzel is our last speaker. She comes to us from NOAA. She's the acting director of the National Marine Protected Area Center in Silver Spring, Maryland. The MPA Center's mission is to develop an effective, comprehensive, representative national system of marine protected areas working with existing MPA federal, state, and territorial and local programs. Before joining the MPA Center, Lauren worked to develop and implement smart growth practices and nutrient reduction strategies for Chesapeake Bay while working at the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. Lauren has an MS in Natural Resources Policy and Management from University of Michigan and a BA from Oberlin College in Ohio. Please welcome Lauren Wenzel.
All right, thanks, Bret. I really appreciate being here in the Fish and Wildlife Service family as a